to transition from proof of work to a hybrid of proof of work and proof of stake in a conservative way, or I mean cautious way. So rather than just completely changing the consensus protocol at once, let's see if we can introduce proof of stake in a safer way and sort of vet that it is working well before continuing on. The next goal is we don't want to disrupt existing use cases wherever possible. So hopefully existing wallets should continue working the same way. Mining, the process and the infrastructure for mining shouldn't change. But what will very likely change would be mining rewards from blocks would change. And the reason is we want to maintain the issuance schedule and supply cap of Zcash, but we would also need to be funding the proof of stake piece. So that would have to come either out of dev fund or mining, because it has to come out of new issuance one way or another. Full node operation should hopefully be mostly the same. Like you'll run a daemon, it'll make network connections. For like existing RPC interfaces, I don't anticipate would be disrupted too much or could be made backwards incompatible. So all of those use cases could hopefully be unimpacted by this change. I think Ethereum did a great job of that during their transition process into proof of stake, where the sort of user land, like the wallets and the smart contracts, were unimpacted and continued operating transparently. And then a final goal is, can we have a design that maintains as much as possible the pieces of existing consensus and code and our reasoning about the consensus protocol and the code and its security? Can we maintain or preserve as much of that as possible without disrupting it? Okay, so any questions? I'm going to check for questions as we go so that they don't pile up. So if you have questions, raise them as I go.
Mic too.
Yeah, just raise your hand or whatever.
Hello, hey Nate.
Hey.
You mentioned that mining rewards will be affected. Is there some thought given to possible reward, sustainable fund collection from transaction fees? And if that is to be implemented, how will that work out with trailing finality?
Okay, so it seems worth exploring. I'm a little bit skeptical that it could work out well, at least with this design approach, and because this design has an issue. So basically, you want to make sure that there's enough rewards to meet some security goals. That's the main part of the challenge. And then there's all these different constraints, like keeping the issuance cap, like the supply cap and the issuance rate. So it's an open question, an area, and like I actually don't talk directly about what could the reward or the yields be or anything like that in this talk. Open question, but I think that the rewards going to proof of stake and the rewards going to mining need to be roughly on par in this design. But maybe there's a different kind of design, so definitely something I want to investigate more. Okay, moving on, the next part is just defining what trailing finality is. So this is a description of proof of work, and this is the view of a single node at two different times. So let's see, yeah. So time 0, the node sees all of the blocks up to G. These are all blocks. And then at a later time, it sees a new block, H prime, and that points to some other new blocks, G prime and F prime, that the node hadn't seen before. And with proof of work fork choice rule, the node prefers this chain over that one as being the canonical chain. And so when that happens, we would say F and G are rolled back because they get replaced by these new blocks. So that's proof of work. Trailing finality. So we begin with the same view of a sequence of blocks, but now a lot of the initial blocks are called final, and those are the ones with the cute corner markings. And then there's proof of work blocks behind that in a suffix. So we can refer to a final prefix and a dynamic suffix or a proof of work suffix. And so now we want to talk about some new rules that nodes are going to follow. So one is a rule about chain validation. So I call it a clause because there's a bunch of other rules like transactions have to be signed and the zero knowledge proofs have to validate, and all of those remain. But now we're introducing a new one that the chain has to have this final prefix, and the final prefix is like coherent, like there's not gaps in it, or there's not conflicting final blocks. Then there's this other new rule B, which is not something that can be verified or validated, as far as I know, and it's just something well-behaved finalizing nodes do. Okay, so I call these finalizers, and what they are proof of stake nodes that are doing the proof of stake protocol, which are often called validators in other contexts, and I hate that use of the word because wallets are validators, so that's just my soapbox about that word. So in this whole thing, I call those finalizers. So the well-behaved ones don't finalize a block unless the suffix is larger than some constant k. So in the example up above, if k were 3, the finalizer would not finalize D until it sees a new block. Okay, so there can be a rollback in the proof of work suffix that behaves pretty much just like the original proof of work diagram. So time 0, a node sees G, time 1, it sees H1, and it rolls back these two, it rolls back F and G in favor of F prime and G prime. And so there's a new clause to the fork choice rule that if the two options have the same prefix, then you just do normal proof of work fork choice. But now, here's a new thing. If you're choosing, if a node is choosing between two options and one would require rolling back a final block, then that is not allowed. So in this example, even though I double prime is longer, because it would require replacing D, and D is final, that's prevented. And the way we prevent that is there's a new clause to the fork choice that says we prefer the chain with the longer finality prefix. Okay, now there's this new complication because in proof of work fork choice, the decision is, it's like a complete function, like the decision, you're given two options and you always pick one. There's no, that's the only outcome. But with finalizing protocols, it's possible to see a violation, which is bad news. And when that happens, fork choice can halt the gadget. When this happens, the protocol can't magically recover from it, as far as I know. I think it's definitely true of the VFT protocol. I'm not sure about anything more clever that could be done, but what I'm proposing is it just halts. It's a loud message, and the humans have to figure out what happened and how to fix it. And this happens with the finalizing proof of stake protocols. Sometimes they halt, you may have noticed. And that's true here of this finality gadget, and that's a consequence of preferring finality. If you want finality, you have to accept that the protocol might halt. Okay, so here's a summary of these new rules. So first of all, when we're validating a chain, we have to make sure it has the final prefix. And the final prefix is coherent, so there's no conflicts or gaps. There's a new default behavior rule that we don't finalize unless we've seen more than k blocks in the suffix. And then there's multiple updates to fork choice rules. So first of all, if the two options have the same common final prefix, then just do the normal proof of work choice. If one has a longer finality prefix, you prefer that. And if there's a violation, you halt the gadget. Any questions there? There's some questions.
So for the clause D here, fork choice clause, prefer the chain with a longer finality prefix is the finality-based preference.
Yeah.
Is that going to potentially run into an issue in high-frequency reorging situations where, because the proof of work component focuses on most work rather than longest chain, you could have a situation where you're oscillating between a very short suffix with high work and a longer suffix that with lower work or like near work. And is there a need to consider the work in the final prefixes rather than just their height?
I don't know. So yeah, it's something I would want to dig into more.
I was pretty much about to ask something similar. Essentially, you have a problem when you do switching, because you have to have a quantitative measure of proof of work and be able to measure the proof of stake. And you can have multiple ways to measure it, but you need to flip. Otherwise, you have a big problem with C.
A big problem with what?
Your fork statement, like choose statement, right? So that could be a weak one. If transition happens...
A problem with D, you mean? Or?
C. Yeah. Different, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I thought D was the tricky one because C is they both.
C is like if you end up actually having a smaller proof of work, and when the transition happens, then that becomes tricky.
Oh yes. So I think one problem here is okay. First of all, I may not mean longer. Okay. Yeah. So it's an issue. Good questions. Thanks. Heavier?
Isn't that the word? Yeah, heavier is what effectively is used for the proof of work component. So I'm just wondering if maybe like a way to fix that might be to have like the boundary between those two be based on work, and then maybe either a secondary boundary behind that based on height if you want to have a simpler metric elsewhere, or maybe just base the boundary for the switch from C to D on work rather than like there being the suffix is at least k blocks, maybe the condition becomes the suffix has at least this much extra work.
So
we effectively had this conversation just before we walked in. We were discussing the difficulty adjustment problem. He's kind of referring to that in that sense.
Well, okay, so one thing about D is you have to prefer the longer finality prefix because you can't pretend you didn't learn a block became final. Otherwise, you're violating the safety of finality. So... When
I said D, I probably actually meant B in that case. I was like, I was meaning the length component. So it'd be easier to think about it in terms of B and C as opposed to D and C then.
Yeah, I'm not. So yeah, actually, with the fork choice rule, yeah, I think there may be a problem with how they're written, and there may be an improvement. I'm not very clear on how difficulty adjustment ties into it yet. So these are all welcome to the workshop. Yes. So I think as we keep going, we're going to find a lot of things like this. So, but I'll just keep going. So maybe we can find good, coherent fork choice rules. And that was sort of an introduction to what rollbacks look like, what finality looks like in terms of what a node sees in terms of a sequence of blocks. So, okay, and then what the rules could be or might be, and maybe they need improvement. But okay, so if we want to do that and we want those rules or some new rules, how could we design the overall consensus system? Or maybe I'm more focused on the code architecture here. But this is how I would think about implementing it. And first, instead of actually implementing it, I'm going to use an idealized black box. So that's the lightning cloud that's called an idealized trailing finality oracle. And so the first thing is this proof of work node on the right here is largely just the existing like NU5 full nodes with no change, with minimal changes. And then the minimal changes are, there's this other component, the idealized oracle. They notify it when they have seen new proof of work blocks, and then the oracle lets them know when one of those blocks that it previously reported has become final. Yeah, we're assuming both components behave correctly for the safety of the user. So we're not imagining either component itself is malicious. But yeah. So, however, it may be feasible and like worthwhile for the components to be double checking each other. For example, a finality oracle should halt if there's a violation of finality that it detects, but the proof of work node could also check that easily. But that's sort of a defense in depth engineering idea. Okay, so here's some of the questions I have. I'm sure there's more questions, and these are my questions, so I wouldn't at all be surprised if there's already like research or designs that answer these. So one is, I don't understand why there's trailing in the first place. So how should we pick K? Because it's obviously better for convenience if it's smaller, because then users have to wait less time for finality. And if it's super high, then the system is might theoretically be different than what we have today, but practically it's not, because we haven't seen really large rollbacks. And I believe it's already the case that rollbacks larger than maybe 100 blocks are exceptional, and nodes might halt or some other badness may happen anyway. So K equals 100, why bother? K equals 0, is that dangerous? That's sort of that first bullet. Second bullet is we want to analyze a bunch of like security cases in more depth. I haven't done this well yet. And Kartik, if he's in here, reminded me yesterday that it's really important to for each of the cases to consider the known minimum cost to attack. So let me describe these cases. So one is, and these are just like extreme cases that are kind of easier to think about. There's also subtler cases involving well, I'll get to those. But the extreme obvious cases are, what if you have a 51% miner who can't compromise the trailing finality oracle? What if the trailing finality oracle is compromised, but all of the miners are good? And then what if trailing finality is compromised and a small fraction of miners is compromised? And then there's actually, this isn't complete at all, by the way. There's, for compromising the trailing finality oracle, there's going to be some subcases. So one is, what if the attacker can completely control what gets finalized? What if the attacker can cause finality violations? I think and maybe they can also cause the oracle to stall even without a finality violation by just like preventing progress of finality. So these are like some coarse high-level categories of attacks, and then there's, in my mind, and then there's finer-grained attacks like things involving selfish mining, or maybe nuances around the fork choice selection rules, and I'm guessing something about having K lower is dangerous there. So the point about minimum cost to attack is we want to think, let's just take one of these cases. So imagine the TFO is completely owned or controlled by the attacker, and the attacker has a small miner, and then all of the rest of the miners are legitimate. What kind of attack capabilities do they have? Well, one thing that I think they could do is only bless their own miners' blocks as final. And so what might happen over time is that the suffix of the chain will be determined by the legitimate miners, because they have almost all of the hash rate. But every now and then, the finality oracle can just bless its own block, the attacker's block, and sort of negate the legitimate suffix and sort of like lop it off and force a rollback. And that seems somewhat similar to just a pure proof of work if you have a 51% miner. So there may be some differences, but for right now, let's just consider that those two attacks are relatively similar in their impact. Now the question is, how much does it cost an attacker to perform that attack in a pure proof of work situation or in this situation? So in the pure proof of work situation, the cost is the cost of being a 51% miner. So we can sort of figure out what that is. In this situation, the cost is the cost of compromising the TFO. So, and we assume running a small miner is a negligible cost. So what that means is, in this situation, with this design, the cost to do an attack that's similar to a 51% attack is defined by the cost to compromise the TFO, not the cost to compromise 51% of the mining power. So if that's less than the cost to mining 51% of the mining power, then we've just made that kind of attack impact cheaper for the miner, which is bad for security. And so just as it stands now, I'm concerned that this design might mean that the cost to attack metric for the security of a bunch of different attacks is going to be going to be the minimum of the cost to attack trailing finality or the cost to attack miners, which is sad because if we are restricted in issuance, and because of that, the only way to deploy this design would be to split issuance between proof of stake and mining, then we've lowered the security budget of mining and made the cost to attack that cheaper. And meanwhile, we've allocated some security budget to proof of stake but potentially I'm not sure about this, but potentially the cost to attack, that component will be roughly equivalent to whatever the allocation of that security budget is. So maybe this design has in summary, maybe this design has sort of a security metric in terms of cost to attack that's sort of the minimum of the two components. And it would be much nicer if it was like the maximum of the two components. So that's another huge open question that we can figure out in the workshop. Okay, so any questions on that idealized part? So just a reminder, that was like, how do we implement this with an idealized finality oracle? That's just a black box that does the right thing.
I think a follow-up question is, fundamentally, why do we need to rely on a combination of work and stake?
A combination of which two?
So a combination of work and stake as the underlying assumption. Why not rely on just one resource?
Why rely on proof of work and proof of stake? Yeah, it's the whole approach of the design is predicated on the idea that if we could introduce proof of stake without regressing security or disrupting existing use cases, then that would be like the most conservative way to begin a transition, right? So this whole approach is predicated on that. There might be a different approach that's just, like another approach is just switch completely to proof of stake, like at a certain height or something like that. That would be a different approach.
What exactly is needed?
Sorry.
In terms of backward compatibility, what exactly is needed?
Well, there's actually, so back on the goals, there were a few different goals, and we might want to consider them separately, but one was the use case backwards compatibility. So wallets, work the same is one of the big ones. But then another one is this notion that, like, we know proof of work, we understand its security a fair amount, and we have a demonstration of it working in production. So is there a way we can preserve that? That was the motivation. But I think this example of showing that the security might be a minimum of the two components, the answer might be no, we can't really preserve that as much as we want. So thanks for the question.
A quick side note. I just have this question. You are kind of describing the security margin in your head. Have you thought about how much you're willing to pay, as in like the cost involved? Does work involved in building versus, because you have proof of stake, you can actually give a slightly bigger and your uptake could be much faster. So have you thought about that trade-off? So like the stuff you need to build, the effort you need to build versus rewarding mechanism, increasing cryptoeconomic security margin. Does that make sense to you?
No, not yet.
So you can actually have mechanisms slightly complicated that actually takes a bit more time, right? To get enough of security margin, because the uptake is the sum of the two, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a mechanism by which you change the rewarding function, so the uptake is different, so there's this trade-off that you can have, but possibly as a lazy architect, which I would think, which I do, and can I do this with less work, but giving them some extra reward? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, when you say less work, do you mean explicitly proof of work mining?
Yes. I mean, like, not just that plus the delta for actually building the Oracle piece. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, let's talk about it more after this. Because I don't feel like I fully understand the proposal, but it sounds intriguing. Another question?
Excuse me.
On the first slide, you have goals of the protocol.
Yeah.
And then later in the talk, you say there may be a regression in terms of the cost to attack the resulting hybrid system. Is no regression one of the goals? Is there a certain degree of regression that's acceptable?
I didn't write it as one of the goals, and that was just an oversight. But I'm going to retroactively point out that that might be good because what if we're already overpaying for security? So, for example, what if switching to this design halves the cost to attack metric? But what if it turns out we decide that that half is still plenty safe? That could be one thing. Yeah. So I don't think ideally, no regression wouldn't be the goal. Ideally, very ideally, we would perfectly know cost to attack and the payoff of any potential attack, and then we would make a design that's just like barely above that, because that's the cheapest possible safe design. But can't know that for sure, but maybe there are ways we can convince ourselves that it's safe enough. And when I start thinking about like going down that route, it also makes me wonder, do we know if we have enough security currently? Like, how do we know that either? So it's a good topic. And it also ties back into the idea of using transaction fees. This notion of, okay, we got to figure out sort of what the cost to do these different attacks are, and can transaction fees cover that well enough? I think not in this design because of that minimum property. Okay, so we used an idealized oracle, and it's this simple system with just these simple messages going back and forth. But now we want to replace the black box with a real thing. I meant to call it gadget instead of widget because it sounds cooler. But so now we're calling it a proof of stake trailing finality gadget. And so we've replaced idealized with proof of stake because we're using proof of stake to implement the black box. That's what I just said. Here's what the old thing looks like. Now here's the new thing. So if you're like me, I like to do this a little bit. So the new thing, the first thing to note, I renamed this a bit, which will be why becomes clearer in a bit. And now, in addition to the previous messages, there's these new things going back and forth. So one's called roster updates, one's called evidence. The idealized cloud becomes a box, which means it's real now because it's a box. So it's called a finality gadget. So we renamed proof of work node to main node because, as you will see, it needs to know a lot more about proof of stake. So it's no longer just like Zebra or Zcash D today with minor tweaks. It's going to become more complicated. So there's these new fields to the messages, roster updates, and evidence. So one question is, backing up. Remember one of the motivation or one of the goals with the design was, can we just like add new components without complicating existing components safely? Because if we can do that, it seems appealing because we already know how the old components work and the code's already there and so forth. But now I'm saying main node needs to have a bunch of complexity around proof of stake accounting rules. And the question is, why not put all that new complexity in finality gadget, because that's a new thing. So it would sort of follow the goal we had for the design. And this slide has a bunch of words. Don't read any of them, just look here. The finality gadget can only influence fork choice behavior, but it can't do anything about transaction or block validity. The node on the right is the one that validates all of the transactions are valid and the blocks are valid. And it's also the one that's doing the fork choice rule. So all of the rules around accounting for proof of stake need to be embodied in transactions, like any change to if a user wants to bond stake or withdraw rewards or delegate or whatever that is, those are going to be authorized as transactions by their wallets. The main node needs to validate them. I guess you could have a design where the thing on the left is validating all of those rules, but the thing on the right is validating all the other rules, but then the messages between them it's very messy. So this is the proposal is to keep it simple by putting the accounting messiness in the main node. Okay, so now the messages between the two components, like I said, the idealized form was just block status updates. Like, here's a new proof of work block, and hey, that block you told me about is now final. But now we're adding roster updates and evidence. Roster updates are just telling the proof of stake protocol who are the finalizers, or what is their cryptographic info, and what are their voting weights. Any questions? Evidence is something some proof of stake protocols provide where they can notice misbehaving nodes and then record that and tell each other about it. And then some of those protocols do things like slash or fine the misbehaving nodes. And the way that's sort of encapsulated here is whatever that evidence is gets shuttled back to the main node, and then it has to figure out what implication that has for the ledger.
So, rather silly question now. Now that you touched upon the topic of misbehavior, you have two sets of misbehavior, two classes. So you're only capturing one class. And you only have the ability to do something in one class. So is there a mechanism, like a quadratic thing, if somebody does in both sides, that they're attacking both sides and only one is getting slashed in that sense? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, it almost sounds like I thought of two things. I'm not sure if you're saying, but one would be, is there any way to have evidence about proof of work misbehavior?
Yes, absolutely.
I hadn't thought of that.
Okay.
And the other might be, what was
if you attack on both sides. So I have two choices, because this is fluctuating. When the transition happens, it's fluctuating. You have a strategy to attack both sides. And if and only if you can actually make it harder, considering both sides, then the security margin gets the sum of it. Otherwise, they might win. I'm just thinking out loud here. I could be completely wrong.
That's really interesting. I wonder if that could also help with the minimum property we don't like. I've never thought of it before, so I'm glad we're doing a workshop. Okay, so proof of stake accounting rules. I don't know, I didn't do anything here yet, but so first of all, I just wanted to point out there's known designs people are working on who seem really smart on integrating proof of stake consensus with private ledger systems that use commit nullify, similar to Zcash. So presumably we can look at what they're doing and maybe just take it wholesale for our purposes, except we have a few things that are unique to Zcash. So one is the issuance constraints. As far as I know, I don't know too well how a bunch of different proof of stake protocols do issuance. I mostly know about Ethereum, but I assume, I'm not aware of any that have like a supply cap or the kinds of constraints we have with Zcash. And yeah, there's a question.
As far as I know, which is not very far, Penumbra and a lot of other systems try to maximize privacy in the sense of how much information is visible to the public about the amount of stake and the behavior of the so-called validators, which in your system are called finalizers. I personally have a contrarian opinion that those things should be transparent to the public instead of being private. And I'm wondering if in your requirements or goals here, there's requirements about the privacy or transparency of these different parts.
I didn't write them down, and I kind of, but it probably should for like a comprehensive design. But as you can see, so far I've been treating the accounting rules as kind of orthogonal. Like we could choose different kinds of accounting rules maybe that would still work with the main design. So for an actual proposal, if we're going to show up to the Zcash community with like zips, all of that would have to be spelled out. But I'm wondering if it's possible to sort of figure out, can the general structure of the trailing finality thing work well enough without knowing the details of the accounting? Does that make sense? Like I want to see if I can tackle that top level problem first, and then, yeah, I would think I think we want some information public for accountability and then other stuff private. And there's a really dumb, simple thing to do that's like approximately close to what I like, which is just use transparent accounting rules, but the only way to, like, let's say the only way to create a staking bond is coming out of the shielded pool. So the bond has a publicly visible amount, and it's associated with a finalizer's ID, which is publicly visible, because you want to know what is the size of the bond. Or if there's delegation, you want to know like what's the total amount delegated. You don't necessarily need to know, well, it's kind of an open question. Do you also want to know like how many delegations there are? That's not Sybil resistant, but you definitely want to know the total amount delegated because the protocol needs to know that for the voting weights, and it seems like we should all know the voting weights of the infrastructure. So yeah, there's some design questions there about privacy and transparency and accountability. Okay, let's do a workshop now. Was there another question?
In general, if all of the stakers have their stake public, at that point, is there any privacy issue compared to the existing system?
Privacy issue, well...
so if I come out of my shielded pool and I say, okay, I want to be a finalizer with 2ZC, at that point, I'm revealing to you that, or I'm forced to reveal to you that I had transactions over 2ZC that came to me.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is there might be a continuum. So maybe I would argue a protocol that could still have, okay, so a protocol where the total, like the voting weight for all of the nodes is known publicly, but who contributed, like how many users contributed to that through delegations or things of that nature could be private. That might be like an ideal in my mind. And the reason is because I'm always sort of keyed into like social, like user activated soft fork. So like what if a validator is known to be behaving poorly and the users want to out of band of the protocol, like halt the protocol, we're going to kick out that validator, like an out of band slashing basically. And the reason I'm really keyed into that is because I thought it happened, or I think it happened once with Steam and Hive. Like Steam had this malicious takeover from the Tron guy. Like Justin Sun, he like bought a bunch of Steam, so he like dominated the validation of the network and then imposed like some change or something that none of the users liked. And so they sort of forked the state of the network and just cut out his balance to make Hive. And I feel like preserving the ability of the community to coordinate things out of band is really valuable. So sometimes I like transparency for accountability. But there could be a range of different people have different positions.
There's also a problem you run into with updates to the finalizer set, because if you know the balance of like the total weightings at one point, and then someone new comes into the set and you know the total weightings after, you can look at the difference and extrapolate from there, and to reveal some kind of information about the staking size. Yeah. So hiding that at all can be tricky if you wanted to keep the voting weights public.
Yeah. So like one common thing for that kind of issue might be batching, like batching and revealing or whatever, but it's complicated. So workshop. I also have a brainstorm of like other stuff that I think is even different from what we've already put pins in, because there's lots of pins. But one thing we were just kind of talking about is what I think of as social coordination tech. So first of all, we know the gadget can halt. How do users, like what do we tell users? Like what do you do if that happens? Is there a way to, presumably, like a story that sounds good to me is like all of the users are somehow communicating through different channels, and people have done an analysis of what happened and identified a problem, and everyone agrees on, or enough people agree on how to resolve that. And once they agree, they go through a process to restart the gadget. This is basically what all of the BFT protocols have to do if they halt. My concern is if we don't think about that a bit and see if there's ways we can help users coordinate, that it's kind of dangerous because basically I'm concerned that sometimes some BFT protocols, like if they halt, it's just an in-group of validators in a Telegram channel who are like, let's restart the network, tell me your IP number or whatever. And that makes me really nervous because what if some of those folks are malicious and users know that and want to respond to it? What can they do? I just want to think more about that piece of the design. And this is one case where I feel motivated by the hybrid proof of work, proof of stake, because in that case, proof of work is unaffected, so it can hopefully help coordination potentially. So this is just like a grab bag of stuff I'm interested in. So a big one is like, if we switch to this and it worked well, okay, then what's the step after that? And then one about the issuance. Okay, so if we have this issuance constraint that other proof of stake protocols don't have, what does that mean? So I thought for the workshop portion, I would figure out if people are interested in any of these or any of the other things, and we would chat about that. So I asked for this here, but it's because I sort of imagine like a group of people hanging around a table, like brainstorming stuff, which you're all welcome to do after this talk, but that was my thought for the workshop. Okay, then there's some URLs. There's some writing about this at a GitHub repository, but actually just using the issue tracker is like the most helpful thing for me right now. Just filing issues about these big picture problems so we know how to tackle this more. And then aside from digging into this design or considering alternatives, I just wanted to share the idea also with the broader Zcash community to see if it makes sense. Like the motivations slide at the beginning, the goals, are those the ones other people in the Zcash community, are those the ones they want us to work towards, or what? Because we want to sort of collaborate with the community as we go, so that as it's maturing, it's something we feel confident everyone is supportive of and understands, rather than just showing up with like a full package. So that's that. Any further questions or comments? Any workshopping to be done? Okay, I think we can wrap up early. Are there any questions from Huva?
Yep, there are some questions in
Oh,
Huva.
oops.
Would it help to have a slow start with the proof of stake rewards, like the Zcash original proof of work slow start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if the original slow start to Zcash was really a good idea. It made sense at the time. So for people who aren't familiar, when Zcash launched, instead of just having the fixed block reward like Bitcoin, at the beginning, the reward ramped up from like 0 up to a fixed amount. And the thinking we had, or the motivation we had, was if let's say there's one miner who has set up mining and they have like some secret sauce for mining really well on day one, and then everyone else is just hobbyist users, we didn't want them to mine a bunch of the supply really early. So we wanted to like dribble the supply out, but there are like some unforeseen impacts. So the most famous one or infamous one is the price was ridiculously high initially because the supply was ridiculously tiny. So if you ever see those early price charts of Zcash where it was like, you know, $10,000 or whatever, what I recommend is don't just look at the price, try to look at exchange volume, because it was a tiny, tiny supply. But anyway, so I'm not sure that would be a good way to activate. I haven't thought too much about activation. It was one of the further work points. But my intuition is it might be good to have a warm-up phase similar to what Ethereum did, where people can begin bonding Zec to begin staking, but the actual staking doesn't happen for a while, and we can sort of see, is that amount growing enough to meet sort of the security goals that we expected before it activates. It's just a brainstorm.
Yep.
That idea sounds like a good idea. This is just a tiny historical data point. Not that I think slow start is a great idea, but the problem and the pricing that you described would have been the same without slow start, because with or without slow start, the total supply started at 0 and went up incrementally to 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. The only difference was how many days it took. So that may not have made that much difference in the market.
Oh yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. Was there another Hoover question, or was that it?
Yep, there's one more. Currently, some nodes use a fork choice rule that depends on local node states, such as the block download timestamp. Can we choose a fork choice rule that is always globally consistent?
Oh yeah, I wasn't aware that nodes use local information for fork choice, but that seems risky. I would agree. You want fork, like the ideal for proof of work, like one of the strengths of proof of work is a new node can receive a block history and then receive a second one and just immediately choose which one has more work without any other, without knowing anything else, I thought. And that seems really powerful. So I feel like we want to try to preserve that if we can.
Sorry, just going back to slow start for proof of staking rewards.
Yeah.
That actually wouldn't be a problem now because the circulating supply of Zeke is so high. So you could actually introduce a slow start in proof of stake if you wanted to. You wouldn't have the same restricted supply. I mean, the circulating supply is 14 million Zeke and change now, so it wouldn't be like it was in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully followed that. Do you mean the issuance rate is already what it is? So
the circulating supply is already high.
Oh yeah,
Whereas in the beginning,
it wouldn't have the issue with the price.
The price,
or whatever.
yeah. So you could introduce the proof of staking rewards and not have the same sort of crazy.
Yeah, the
exchange.
thing is, if the so this is something I need to learn more about. But if you're trying to estimate minimum cost to attack, you make assumptions about how much Zec is, or like how big the bonds are. If the rewards are tiny, you probably expect smaller bonds if people are only caring about immediate financial implications. If there's a bunch of like Zcash fans who just want to post bonds to be supportive, that might change. But if it's just based on the rewards, it might be a small amount, so then you'd have a small amount of security. So I'm not sure if it's safe.
Yeah, I think the issue there would be less about the circulating supply in the network, but more the circulating supply in the bond. Is maybe a way to think about that. Yeah. What was the point we were just at before? Oh, about the timestamps for proof of work. Yeah, that's the Bitcoin has always had a like future rule, which we inherited of like it doesn't accept things more than a certain number of hours in the future of the local timestamp.
Oh yeah.
And then there's other changes that were made related to like medium time passed. Most of that is deterministic, but there are a couple of changes that we made for defense against various network time attacks. So there is a bit of a trade-off going there in terms of what you're defending against.
Yeah.
Okay, thumbs up. Thank you, Nate.
Okay, thank you.
And one note on schedule, the Zcash ecosystem grant funding panel just started in the other room, so if you want to attend that, you need to switch rooms, and if you want to attend the Zebra update talk, that will be in this room in 10 minutes.